Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be listening to Detta, hänt by the band Gösta, Berlings, Saga.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
I know, in the past I've said some Swedish names on here and I've always mispronounced them. Hopefully this time I got it right, I don't know. Any of you who speak Swedish in the audience, I'd love to know if I actually said this one right or at least close to it. Anyway, here's some of my favorite bits from this album. So I do believe that one of the biggest scientific discoveries ever has to be the fact that we discovered that the best prog ever comes out of Sweden. Of course I'm joking, but we see time and time again that this is true, although you can't really say this is for true really, because one, music is subjective, and two, if you look hard enough you will find shit prog even from Sweden. But bands like, Beardfish, Moon Safari, Cultivator, The Flower Kings, and obviously Anglagard, all of them are so good, and it just shows time and time again that since the decline of prog in the late 70s, it seems like Sweden was always pumping out good album after good album. But of course I wouldn't be making this kind of intro if we weren't to be talking about a Swedish band, so of course today's band of topic is Gösta, Berlings, Saga, and the album is Detta, hänt, which means this has happened. Now this band started off in 2004 in Stockholm in Sweden. Now these guys were only a pair at the beginning, and they soon realized that in order to actually expand their musical sound they needed to find more players. Thus they've added 2 more players and formed a 4-man quartet, which was better for their success as a whole. Now you might have noticed that I'm kind of slightly disdaining from using names on here. I'm not calling the band by their name, I'm not calling the individual persons by their names, just because it's too hard for me to remember these Swedish names all over the place. I'm gonna use them only when it's necessary, but in other cases I'm just gonna go around it. But if there's one name that I should point out, it's actually not a name of one of the band members, but one of the contributors to be found on this album, and that is no other than Mattias Olsson from the band Anglagard. He is on here and he's in charge of the special sonic effects and on the loops, and by god, this album would never have been the same without him. I don't know how these guys, very much unknown with their sophomore album, got the experience of this type of person on their album, but they did, and he came on and he contributed and made this album as great as it is. But of course it's not just him for the reason that this album is good. There are plenty more reasons, and more of them of course coming from the band themselves. themselves. But before I speak about that, let's speak a bit more about the backstory for this album's creation. So the band, as I said, formed in 2004, and by 2005 they were basically playing as some sort of an underground band in clubs in Stockholm, and they were basically just waiting for someone to discover them until one day they were approached by a producer who wanted to help them produce their debut album. And so it happened, they produced that album, and it was called Time Is Sound, of course in Swedish, which I don't know how I'm supposed to say that, and the album released and it kind of just flopped. That doesn't mean that that album was bad in any way, just it didn't really have an audience back then, but the band realized what their wrongdoings were and they tried to improve them, and thus they wanted to work on recording a new album, and then 4 years afterwards they came with their second sophomore release, which is the album we're reviewing today, being As It Happened, being This Has Happened, and now they proved this one to be more successful, and fortunately it was. And when I started listening to this album, I quickly started unfolding all of the influence that can be found on here. You can find things like King Crimson all the way to Anglegarden, even all the way back to traditional Swedish music, and all of them are performed together in this very eclectic form and dance, which I personally really enjoyed. Now overall, this album averaged to me as a pretty great album, with a lot of its tracks being as close to perfect as you can imagine, and some of them being quite good but not more than that. And I do believe that these two song types can be categorized into two categories based on their structures. So you have the songs on here which started as some sort of an energy level and end with the same energy level, with everything in between being, as I said, in the same energy level. You don't really change the moods, you don't really change the amount of energy and emotion and stuff that's put into the song, you just change ideas from here and there, and those are the songs which were kind of forgettable by me and I didn't quite find them as enjoyable. But the other types of songs were the songs which start off very mild, very calm, very, quiet, and then gradually picked it up from there and went higher and higher into some sort of a big celebration of sounds. So examples for such songs has to be songs like Sorterar Gotlandfri or The Mountain Law, or even the track called Indwelling? And while going through others' reviews of this album, I've seen many people praise just the rhythm section of this album, being the drums and the bass, and while I would have to agree that both of them are being played masterfully in a very great way, I just find that the limelight isn't quite on them but more on the keyboards and the guitar, and honestly, I much prefer the keyboards and guitar on here. And honestly, specifically, I really love the keyboards on here. They are so good, so enjoyable, and the variety of them is just amazing. So of course you have a very interesting old piano that has a very unique sound to it, a very interesting timbre, but you also have keyboards like the Glockenspiel or even the Mellotron or a Fender Rhodes, and you have some more exotic things like the Optigan or the haunting Chilton Talent Maker. Now I chose the word haunting very deliberately because that describes the best of what this keyboard player, which is called David Lundberg, does on this album. Every single time he solos or every single time he's just incorporated into the song in a very noticeable way, his keyboards always sound very much beautifully haunting. They're macabre, they're dark, they sound like they come from a ghost infested house, and I love that so much. Whenever you make music, you gotta make it engaging, and this is a way of doing so. There is no way that I listen to any of his keyboard parts without just, focusing on them, thinking about how they sound, and just wanting to get more of them. And while I loved a lot of things about this album, I do also believe that it has its shortcomings, especially in the moments where this band just kind of goes into a loop of repetition and they don't quite know where they're gonna get out of it. I don't know why they did this because they can be highly dynamic, but there are certain points on this album which felt kind of monotonous to me, and that was even further exemplified with the ending for this album, in which there's basically a 3-minute just repetitive, sort of improvisation, but not a lot of things are going on, and it just gradually builds up more and more, and it doesn't come to any good realization at the end. It just kind of dwindles outwards. Then we have 2 more minutes of whatever that is. I'm actually not entirely sure how I can describe that, and then the album ends, and that's fine, but it's kind of a lackluster when bands do that. So I do believe that this album could have been a bit shorter, but overall greater. But I do think though that this album specifically specifically is one to mark and remark time and time again because it has so many good things about it. And if you're a fan of Swedish prog or even eclectic prog as a whole and you don't know this album quite yet, this is definitely a must listen for you. So if anyone is new to this album and I've introduced you to it, you know what? You're welcome. It is great. Now let's move on to talking about this album's cover. So at first when I looked at this cover, I kind of just didn't know what I was looking at. I didn't know what I was thinking about it, but then I took a step back and I started realizing that it has a deeper meaning to it. Now, of course, as any form of art, there is no one right meaning for it and anyone can interpret it in the way they want. So what I'll tell you right now is my personal interpretation for what this album cover means. So on the left side of this cover, we see what seems to be a hand being laid across a floor, and on the right side, we have something that looks kind of parallel to it, basically mirroring it, but it's more of an electronic piece. And the two of them exist in the same realm and they try and mimic each other in a way. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that's supposed to mean, but personally, I took this as the way of the personal human playing and technology going hand in hand. Pun intended. Because when you come to think of it, anything from the plethora of keyboards to be found on here to Olsen's special effects and loops, and of course the electric guitar and the electric bass, all of them culminate in a way that technology could only provide us in making music. And that's the way it goes, and that's how good music can be made even when we're not only using acoustic instruments, and for that I do believe that the band wanted to cherish that idea in the form of this cover. Yes, I do believe that this cover would have benefited from being a no text cover, thus meaning to remove everything in the middle, leaving just a white plain floor. But you know what, it's fine as it is, I'm just thinking outside of the box, but I guess that they did want to put their name out there and that's entirely understandable. So this album was an odd case where I kind of just knew from the start what rating I'm gonna give this one. I kind of just didn't expect it to go any lower than it did, but just also not any higher, and thus I kind of knew that the proper rating for this one would be an 8 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Inget Nytt under solen by the band Kaipa. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Claywon and Bristol Kings and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.